Hello, everybody. Welcome. Um, I'm here with Cecilia.
Hello.
You know Cecilia from the video we did last month, I think it was, Cecilia, talking about the Neville subreddit and several other things, including probably most importantly, revision and how wonderful a technique that is that Neville shared with the world. Cecilia is, as I said, was the former kind of like the main moderator, I would describe you as, of the Neville subreddit for a year or two. Very well versed in these Neville lectures and Neville teachings, as well as other law of assumption, law of attraction type approaches. And one of the few people I know who speaks somewhat sanely and intelligently about Neville's later lectures, which she likes a lot. And, I made a video the other day. You probably want to watch that video before this one because we're going to jump right into it. But basically, Cecilia and I were texting about how it seems like Neville, later in his career, generally speaking, probably after the promise, definitely by the late 60s, though. He died in 1972. Definitely by the late 60s. He was saying that when he did an imaginal act, he would just do it once. He would plant the seed and then it's done. And he said, that's how I always did it. And Cecilia and I were talking about how, was that the case? Because that's certainly not the impression that we got or that I got reading Neville over the years. It seemed like he would go to sleep, in the imaginal scene several nights in a row, if need be. And obviously, a lot of the success stories that we hear from Neville, in terms of his case histories, like in The Power of Awareness and The Law and the Promise, people are reenacting their imaginal scene to fulfillment night after night. And here's Neville near the end of his career saying, no, I never did that. I just did it once and it was done. So there's a lot of nuanced stuff to look at here that I think is kind of important. Cecilia, you'd say that's pretty much, is that like how you kind of, in terms of the one-time imaginal thing, is that the initial impression you got when you read these later lectures, some of these later lectures?
Yeah, and I'm kind of pulling up the one that I was taking forever, but pulling up the one that I specifically was talking about, just because the question and answer, it was actually in the question and answer, and essentially it was folks asking like very specific questions. And on that note too, you had found like a similar lecture, or the same named lecture, but different question and answers, and I think whole different lecture itself. So that was one thing that I've noticed a couple times too, that I just want people to be kind of aware of, is that sometimes if somebody says, oh, I read this in XYZ lecture, I think he reused names.
Right. And sometimes I think
once.
he did. And sometimes I think the lecture names, it wasn't even necessarily him who it was just somebody recorded it and could have titled it that. So yeah, for instance, what was the lecture that you sent? That you sent the one from 1969, I think, but there's also a 1963 version with the same lecture, I should say, with the same name.
The Wonder Working Power of Attachment.
The Wonder Working Power of Attachment. So there's a 1963 and 69 lecture, but do you have the 69 lecture, that Q&A up there?
Yeah, I've got it up now. So the one that kind of came, it was somebody asked, like, when is the Sabbath in our imaginal activity? When do we rest? And the reason it stuck out to me so much is because that question gets asked a lot. I think when people get into anything with this, like it's something that you'll see in the subreddits or in YouTube videos, etc. You just kind of see that a lot. And he responds with, like, having done it, you are not concerned. You know it must come to pass. Having done it, you simply drop it. If I plant in confidence a seed in my garden today, I don't pick it up tomorrow morning to see how it's coming. I leave it in confidence that it contains within itself a pattern of itself, and therefore it must come out. So I don't dig it up. I walk in confidence that it's done. I'm too busy planting other things. And, he kind of says, like, he goes on, and I don't want to just like read everything to folks, but
you totally can.
So the next one was like, ask, well, in your own experience, have you found a reaction within yourself that tells you you've done it? And he said it's a sense of relief. And he says then that it's dropping it. He said, in fact, I would suggest to anyone, try it and fall asleep in the act. Just put yourself into it. And then if it's only a little nap of, say, 1 minute, a few seconds, say you could drop it. It's the dropping of it. If you hold on to still thinking, well, did I do it? Then you didn't do it. And so it was kind of interesting because folks like, here's where he says, somebody says, well, the first time it's exhilarating, you get such a feeling, but then you go over it the next day or night, and that for some reason gets boring, is what people are saying. And he says, well, I don't do it beyond the first. I don't plant the seed over and over. No, I just do it once. When I do it, and then I know I've done it. And so we went back, you and I were kind of talking about his story about the army. And we know that in his books, he said that he continued to reenact this in his imaginal act for like 8 days. And on the 9th day, or 7 days and the 8th day, whatever it was. But
Right.
and then on the 9th day it came to pass. So and I have read, and I'd have to go back and find them, where he says you do it until it comes to fruition for you. But here you say, no, you only do it once, then you let it go and you move on. And I've seen that a lot in his later works where he says you only have to do it once and you move on. And somebody actually, which I thought was really fun because people do this now all the time, the next question was, your books are confusing because you said night after night you went to sleep thinking of something lovely. They're like, if I'm telling the story as someone else told me, I must tell it in their language without altering it to fit a certain pattern. So he essentially goes on to say, I only say that when I'm sharing somebody else's story, not my stories. So it was interesting because I'm like, no, I don't think so. Because even talking about getting his wife, getting the divorce and remarried, he says that for a week he went to sleep imagining. So I
Right.
don't know, and we talked about this, right? I don't know, like, is it old age memory loss? Is it something where it's just like kind of slipping his mind? It's years before, 20, 30 years before.
Right. These are old
And
events. That's not like this
yeah,
happened
these are
yesterday.
old
Yeah.
events, but he talks about them all the time. So I can understand why there's confusion with it. And we can only speculate today what he actually means because he's not here to tell us what he actually meant. But that was kind of what I think spurred this question is, okay, is it once or is it ongoing?
Right. I think the most important thing is the approach. I think it's why it interests both of us is more like, practically speaking, for people who are into doing the imaginal act or into testing these different techniques of Neville's, are both these approaches sound, or is there one more sound approach for you in the situation? So, and I do want to add, someone made a comment when I made the video the other day talking about the one time or multiple times about the army story. They correctly said in some of his later lectures, I think the Law of Liberty is one of the lectures. He says in that Law of Liberty lecture, I only did the imaginal act once. He goes, I fell asleep in New York, imagining I was in New York City, not in the barracks. And then at 4 a.m., I awoke with a vision of being honorably discharged. And he goes, I knew it was done. And then he said that was it. And, you could argue, well, he when he went to sleep the next night, maybe he knew it was done, but that's different than reenacting it night after night after night. So there definitely is this noticeable shift in how he describes how they evoke the feeling and how you wear the mood. If, as he says in some of his later lectures, there's a shift in how he says to do it from his earlier stuff, from, in my opinion, more practical, especially like if you're a Neville newbie or whatever, like the 5 lessons type stuff. The idea is, if you have that feeling and it's over, that's great, it's done. You just stay with it. But if you can't, I think most people interpret it that you're going to reenact that scene over to get that fulfillment again. And you do that as often as you need to have that sense of certainty. And the idea being that you need that sense of certainty that it is done in order for it to manifest in your world. Again, the law and the promise, there's all these examples of that, of people doing it week after week, month after month, in order to get their manifestation to occur in the 3D. It's just very different as a practical approach, then you do SATs once, you feel it go out of you, or the explosion, or like the conception, the orgasm, whatever language you want to use. And that's it.
Yeah. And so I have that lecture up too, right? And he does talk about how he did it, and he saw at the 4 a.m. he woke up and he saw the approved stamp. And this is a story that I would think most people that know Neville are very familiar with, because it's kind of a common one that I think he uses a lot. And he does say at the end that, it was too early to disturb the other fellows sleeping there. And I waited until the very first moment that I could leave that room, and went down to the latrine and shaved and bathed early, and came up filled with a glow that the whole thing was done. I walked in that assumption for the next 9 days. So where I guess I don't know, struggle is the right word. Struggle is probably not the right word. But where I kind of keep going back over stuff is, okay, he's saying that he walked in that assumption, and he pushes, revision quite a bit. Now, in his other book, it's chapter 23, Power of Awareness, I believe, he says, I reenacted this board.
He uses the term reenacted.
Uses the word. And I know this because I think you and I both went back to reread it this morning before this conversation.
Yeah.
So I was trying to justify it almost as like, well, maybe he's saying that one planting of the seed is kind of one thing, but once you change, like, you have to change yourself for this stuff. You can't. You can't stay within the old story of it. So then is it just being in that assumption? But that's not really reenacting it. So
exactly. Yeah. Sleeping like it's done, knowing it's done, it's not reenacting. It's a very different thing. The stories that we read about in Power of Awareness, the Law and the Promise, as well as the hundreds, if not thousands of stories on the subreddit, are very often people reenacting, not just sleeping as if it's reenacting over and over again, to feel it over and over again, that relief, the power of that, like, multiple times, in order to finally see the thing manifest, a week, 6 weeks, 6 months, a year later.
But now that you and I are talking, I have this thought that maybe this difference in when people are struggling and are reenacting is that they're not reenacting from this, like, it's done and I'm kind of continuing to bask in this new reality for myself, but instead I'm redoing it because I didn't do it right yet.
Right. So they're digging up the seed every day and having to
every single day.
Yeah.
And I think I've fallen into that. I think I've done that.
Absolutely. As have I. Yep. But like, one reason I think I have done that too is because I feel it once. I'm like, and then of course you start like, oh, that's not enough. And so you try to reenact it, but you don't feel as pure, or you don't get the relief the second or the fifth time you do it. And then it you become doubtful. While Neville's saying, he's always said, it's done. It's been done from the beginning. And that's the idea behind, you only have to do it once. And, we had a couple of people commenting, and of course this makes total sense. If you have the conviction that Neville certainly had by the end of his career, I mean, I think he had it throughout it, but certainly by the end, he didn't really give a shit. I mean, he was like, I know this works. This is done. Like, I only have to plant it once. It's done. I make that assumption.
Yeah.
But one thing that's interesting, I was just speaking to someone about this, is like, it is a different perspective, in the sense where, like, let's say that you have, an injury or something like that to your leg, and you imagine that you're fully healed. The first time you do the imaginal act and you feel that relief of being healed, there's that great relief. Right. But if you're then, wearing that mood, that relief is still there, but it's minor. It's like, oh yeah, my leg's healed. It's not a big deal. It's not like night after night you're now trying to re-heal your leg. You already healed it, or like you want that new, I'm trying to give cliche examples, like just to, you want that new car. So you do SATs and you feel it, the relief of, oh my gosh, it happened. I have the new car. You then they'll go back and replicate it every night. You already have the car. It's done. Right. So there's some nuances here. I mean, a lot of people listening to this are going to be like, well, you guys are just, this just doesn't matter. You guys are just debating little things. But I think it's important as a general approach. I think it's two different approaches to this stuff. At least two different approaches between, like, the finality of, like, it's done. I'm using brazen impudence now. Like, it's finished. Like, it's not even a big deal because it's already finished, as opposed to trying to, like, actively evoke the state over and over again. I would say the latter is much more popular, justifiably so. Like Power of Your Subconscious Mind, for instance, Murphy, who obviously is probably the most similar teacher to Neville in terms of his approach to a lot of his approaches. He talks about bathing in it night after night as well. You know, like the idea of just bathing in it once and then it's done is there's something much more casual about it, for both good and bad. I mean, I think it depends on your sensibility and in the situation you're in. Is that making sense to you, Cecilia? If it's not making sense to you, it's definitely not making sense.
No, I think that it does. I think it just kind of, it's almost this like weird, I don't know, it's still, to me, is going to come down to the faith aspect. And that's a lot of what we talked about when we chatted last time. And so, I mean, because there's a lot of folks who are doing this night after night who are coming back and saying, this doesn't work. Like, I'm going to sleep every night assuming that, you know, the person that I love is laying beside me and I'm alone. So yeah, I mean, I think it still just comes down to faith. And it's difficult though to determine like what builds your faith, right? So like, you know, continually trying to manifest some colored tennis ball or climbing a ladder may at the beginning kind of be this like, whoa, that's kind of nuts moment. But you know, that, I don't know, it's so easy to justify that as some sort of like weird coincidence. And then when you're trying to do something bigger, but you don't actually change, and you don't change the way that you're looking at the world and the way that the world looks back at you, then you just kind of continue in the same cycle. And he actually talks about that quite a bit, I'm going to say in some of the later lectures as well, but of, you know, you have to be seen by others. Like if others don't change the way that they've seen you, you haven't actually changed anything. But it, you know, I also don't want to overly complicate it for myself, and I tend to do that quite a bit. But, and I think this conversation, you know, gets a little bit into that, but there's still folks, myself included, that have things that, like, there's little things that are super easy. Like I'll share an example that was quite shocking. You know, I'm a big revision person. And so I had sent a note, an email that I really did not think was the greatest thing to send. And I didn't have a way to get that back. So it's like, shit, what do I do? So I revised it, that I didn't send. That I never sent it is actually what I revised, that I just had not done that message. That's the last message. I left the email, I didn't respond to it, and it was done. And a couple days later, the person reaches out to me and they say, I don't know what you sent, but it won't download. Like I've been waiting and it's been saying that it's going to download, you know, for days. And it's now been like a couple weeks and that message never downloaded. And so, you know, and I just kind of brushed it off and never answered because I didn't want to lie to him about what the message was. And I wanted to put the message behind me. So it's like, I'm going to just bring up a different topic and we'll talk about something else instead of this email that I should have never sent in the first place. But so like that kind of stuff, that was simple. I went to bed.
Right.
I did not put much effort into a scene. I've shared with, I think in the last chat and definitely on my Reddit profile, I don't see stuff the way other folks do. I can hear. Some other folks do,
not everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, like some other folks do. I can hear, so like I can do voices. Sounds good. I have voices in my head, but I can pull up voices. You know, like I can hear like you talking to me. I can do that, and I can do some smells. And so I really just kind of repeated gently to myself that the last message that I got was this, like, you know, last email from them that I never replied. And so it's almost hard to explain like what that feeling was, because it's not like I necessarily had a scene. I just had this feeling that I didn't do it. And that was it. That was a one night shot too. That's something that I had some, you know, pretty, it was important to me that this not send, right? And I was kind of a little panicked about it. And so I don't know if it's like that heightened emotion still put something else behind it that made it happen so quickly, but that message never sent.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing story. And the kind of,
thank goodness.
And it's the kind of thing that really makes you question again, like just how powerful our imagination is, you know, when you hear stories like that. And again, the good thing about the Neville subreddit is that you hear stories if you read intelligently on there, which you really can't anymore. It's too hard to glean what's good and what's bad. But there's so many stories like that where you're like, oh my God. Like if you have any doubt that this stuff works on an intellectual level, you just read some of these stories. You're like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think one thing we're getting at too is this is just so nuanced. Like it's like for in this situation, for instance, did you feel like, did you get that big sense of relief, or was it just like, this is like, it's not being sent, like this email is not being sent, or like what, like was it like that, that huge sense of relief, or was it just like, okay, it's done? Or
No, I mean, there was not a huge sense of relief.
yeah, that's what I was curious about, that because that's the thing too, is that it's not always going to be this.
No.
I mean, you give a lot of good revision stories. You mentioned a few last time we chatted on here, where it's just like you just revise quickly, like, oh yeah, no, that didn't happen, and then like it revises, and it's not like
delusion.
Right, you don't put this like insane amount of emotion behind it at all. So it's just like, oh no, like especially if you correct something relatively quickly, a lot of times it's like you just change your thought, and it's a slight shift, and then you'll see a shift in a response or what have you. So I mean, as always, I just feel like it's important to stress that this stuff is not necessarily as dogmatic as it sometimes seems to be. Neville uses such dramatic language, when it comes to like planting the seed and explosion, and but it can be very subtle how it actually works in our lives,
Well, and he even mentioned, he talks like about this like feeling of relief, but I guess we're different strokes for different folks. I don't know what relief felt like to Neville.
Right.
And I think, on top of that, like I know there's a lecture, and I'd have to find it, where he says like, this is like effortless, and it should remain effortless. And the stuff that I have put kind of this like effortless focus into is the stuff that's really happened and like kind of has come sooner. It's when I get too caught up in trying to figure out like what technique's going to work and what I should try and how many times I should do it, that I really get delays, because I think then I'm too focused on the working of whatever this manifestation process is, and less on the feeling of actually having what I'm attempting to manifest. And it's a really easy trap to get yourself into, at least from my experience. But, if you were to, like pride is a good example for me. I don't know how I would describe to somebody that I felt proud. Like I might kind of puff up my chest or something, but that to me is not necessarily pride. That, could be something else. And to you, it might be different. So relief to Neville could have been the same thing that I felt about this email. I just don't recognize it as the feeling of relief.
Yes.
And it's not as big.
Mm-hmm. I do think there's, again, it's nuanced. I feel like that feeling you're describing it has something to do with what we're suggesting to ourselves. Like you felt okay, and that the suggestion, I guess you could say, is that it's solved, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think when Neville talks about relief, because I actually do resonate a lot with that personally, and I totally get why a lot of people do not. I think because Neville was super religious, basically, or spiritual, like for him, he connected it directly with God. Like, so it was like the same idea of like, when Emmett Fox talks about the golden key, and like you take your problem, like you stop thinking about your problem and think about God instead. Or like, we're text chaining about like A Course in Miracles, like this idea of like releasing and expanding to God. So it's like the relief is like, oh, God's here. God will solve the problem. God has taken care of the problem already. That I've always resonated with that. Like for me, like my main application of Neville's approach is I would say that, like for me, it's like go into that place when I can, whether it's in the morning when I wake up, or before bed, or sometime during the day if I have time, where it's just like it's already over. I feel it's already over. Like it's God is here now. Everything is perfect as it is right now. And it's like that for me is relief. But as you said, I mean, we're using these terms, and it's relief, pride, sadness, jealousy, like you use these different terms, and they're going to have different meanings for different people. It's so subjective how this works, you know, in terms of how we respond to these feelings. You know, when people describe states, it's hard. Not everyone's state is going to be described the same way, you know.
Well, and there was, so again, I read a lot of lectures, but I don't keep track of which ones are which. There was a lecture that I read recently where he talked about a gentleman using the emotion of annoyance, and how, you know, he was going to be annoyed if something didn't, you know, come to fruition for him, and it did. And so that was, you know, like this annoyance. And, you know, to your point about like these stories, even if you were to take all of the stories on Reddit, all of the stories on YouTube, all of the stories that I've shared, all of the stories that anybody, you know, has like shared from the books, and even say that 20% of them are true and the rest are people just like spitting horse shit,
Right.
it's still remarkable. And I actually don't think that's the case. I think the majority of people are being honest about them and are not trying to script. But, you know, I also just like tend to try to believe people. Right. That's just my nature a bit. But, you know, there's this remarkable process to this, but trying to find out the process that works like really well for you can be kind of frustrating, especially if you get too caught up in it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, that's the nuance. And like, this isn't about Neville said to do it this way or Neville said to do it that way. Because I mean, what we're saying here is Neville basically said to do it in two separate ways, it seems like.
Yeah, he changed it. Yeah.
It really does seem like he changed it. And that's fine. The point is, notice something like that and don't be stuck in your ways. And again, figure out what it is that works for you. And it may not be Neville's law of assumption. It may be some other approach, you know, it may be some other manifesting approach, you know, but it's being open to that. I wrote, again, just an incredible amount of notes here. Can we talk a little bit more about, like, because I know a lot of people have this, are like you, where like they can't visualize, but like, if I say to you, like apple, like does an apple come to your mind?
Yes, but not like the vision of the apple.
Sure, right. But you think apple still.
I can think of seeing an apple.
Right. Yeah.
And so my daughter, like, she can watch a whole movie in her head. Right. She can pull up a full movie scene. I do not understand this. And I've asked my other kids, and one can kind of see things and one can see very clearly. So I think it's all over the gamut. Like, yeah. And I mean, see mostly black.
We mentioned this last time. Neville makes it very, very clear that you do not have to, and other LOA teachers certainly do this as well, but Neville himself, we usually associate Neville with visualizing, right? But he says time and time again, you can use just terms like, isn't it wonderful? Or thank you, or whatever the fuck you want to use. He advocated short terms because you only want to have a couple words or one word that imply fulfillment, and just repeat that, or repeat a short phrase that someone's saying to you, like you're saying, like you hear someone's voice. That will provide you with the feeling you need to see movement, for things to move for you. Like, I just feel like that can't be stressed enough, you know, because people get obsessed with doing sats in a certain way and like enacting the scene. And it's like, you just do what's evoking the feeling for you, you know? I mean, that so much of this stuff, when it's done effectively, I think it's just what moves you, you know, what moves you so you feel that, like, and it can be subtle, like your example, this last revision example, where it's just, you just feel like, oh, that didn't happen. It's like, okay, it didn't happen.
Like, couldn't send that. Yeah. Well, and so I think there's a couple things that, right, like when I first learned of this stuff, I was driving myself crazy trying to understand this visualization stuff. And I was so focused on trying to see some sort of a scene, which I also want to add that this is something that I've like practiced with, and I can kind of sometimes see things. Now, it's very hard to explain. I don't know if I see it the way that maybe some other people see it, but I feel like it's gotten better. Like my imagination has gotten better. But the other thing where I think people get confused, and I know that I did it first, was what this, like, whatever is the feeling for you. And then that gets complicated as well, where it's like, well, think about the car that you have outside. Okay, how do you know that you have that car? Well, you just know. Like, that's your car. Like, you know that that's your car. You know that these are your shoes. You know that this is your spouse. You know that your hair is a certain color, whatever. It's, if you can get to that type of natural feeling, because it's just it just is. The sun's going to come up tomorrow. Tonight the moon will be out. Like, it's just this very easy assumption that you don't really think about, you don't put a ton of effort into it. And so trying to learn how to do like conscious manifestation sometimes muddies that water, where I think people are looking for this like massive feeling. And sometimes that's what's shared in the books, like from Neville Goddard, is like, oh, you have this like almost orgasmic kind of explosion.
Right.
And I have definitely I've never had issues where, because I didn't have some orgasmic explosion of this is done, right? Like, I have manifested many things just by using simple phrases, but I have learned, especially over the last year, that doing it as I drift off into sleep is extremely helpful for me.
Mm-hmm.
So finding it, just like think of the person, like there was one, where I wanted a person to show forgiveness, right? They were really upset with somebody. They refused to like talk to them. They wouldn't be in the same room with them. And it was causing a lot of, like issues for my life, because when it comes down to it, most of the stuff is for selfish reasons that you do it. It's kind of human nature. But so it was causing issues for my life because I couldn't have these people in the same room. And it was really causing some strife. And it was more on one person being very angry. So for about, and this is where I don't know, I can't remember how long I did it. To this point, this was a couple years ago, I would just bring this person up to my head. I know it was more than once. I know it was a couple nights in a row, but I don't know how many. And so I'd bring them up into my head, and I would just like kind of chant, forgive. Like, and it was like I would think of them those specifically, and then I would think of the word like forgive, and just feel like a calm, like, oh, okay, yeah, that's good. And it was like night and day. I mean, they just suddenly woke up one day and decided that they were going to forgive, and they didn't want to have those kind of hassles in their life. And they had a great conversation with the person, and everything's been great now for like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. That's
simple
and a perfect application of these broader principles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something else I want to mention is like, Neville stuff, it's so much like it is done, it already happened, right? But you can manifest stuff. A lot of people are going to manifest stuff more easily if they think to this themselves, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. It doesn't have to be, it already has happened. It can be, this is going to happen. I'm getting there. This is, as long as you think that you can do something and convince yourself that you can do it and start to build that conviction, it's very likely going to happen. And, we were texting earlier about the sleep thing. Because I mean, most people who are into Neville obviously value the time before you fade off to sleep.
Yeah.
And that this also can be the value of like taking short naps and stuff. Like there's all these different ways to play with it. But I honestly, I was telling you, like, I almost feel like it's overplayed at this point. Like where, you don't have to go to sleep in the desired state fulfilled. You just don't. Like there's too many examples I can think of people who are very successful, who go to sleep stressed out and like clean their slate. I think even like Abraham Hicks talks about this. Like you clean your slate that's another way of like looking at some of these principles. You clean your slate, you start anew the next day. And the idea is obviously to be moving towards your external manifestation, or to really obviously be wearing the garment, as Neville says,
right,
of having it. But if you feel like crap and you can't get into the state of the wish fulfilled before sleep, you shouldn't necessarily beat yourself up over it. In my opinion, that's a limiting belief to think that you have to be sleeping in the state of the wish fulfilled. And again, that's why I often defer to this more general approach where it's like, well, just try to feel good before you go to bed, or feel okay before you go to bed if you can, and that can be through any number of things. You can be spiritual about it and try to invoke a sense of being in touch with God, which is one reason I think that people pray, whether it's conscious or not, before bed. Or it can just be by like, I don't know, like being nice to yourself before bed, listen to calming music and like I don't, so, you know, but we, as you said, we apply so much pressure on ourselves that we don't need to apply a lot of the time to try to get these ideas to work better for us. And it works best for us usually when it's relatively easy and smooth, you know? Again, I think Abraham Hicks has the saying, like, if it ain't easy, it's not happening.
Well, and to your point though, like, I don't necessarily think somebody has to get into this, like, quote unquote, the wish fulfilled about this specific thing. I think it almost becomes too much of a focus just based on like questions that I've gotten and testing I've done on myself. So if I'm like, okay, like let's say I want $10,000. And before I go to bed, I'm like racking my brain about, okay, I've got to get into this wish fulfilled of $10,000. Okay, well, I'm talking like literally to myself. So myself already knows I want the $10,000. So if I just feel good and relaxed and like everything is wonderful and I do something nice for myself, I wash my face, I do a face mask, I, do like all this kind of stuff that just makes me feel good as a person. And I go to bed just, I guess it's a thankful type feeling, but just in this like relaxed, not much of a care in the world because everything works out for you, I'm likely going to get the 10 grand. It doesn't have to be this very specific, like kind of focused on, like.
But that's the feeling you would have too if you actually had the 10 grand.
Yeah.
It would be one time, maybe you would, again, circling back to what we were initially talking about. You one time, perhaps you think it's the first time you're thinking about it. So maybe it's exciting to think about or whatever, like, oh, I have that $10,000. But the next night, it makes much more sense to be like, well, I already have the $10,000. And maybe, again, this is what maybe like what Neville meant was, going to sleep like in that state of already having it. Right. And it's like, then it's like, you put a nice face mask. You would treat yourself differently maybe if you had the $10,000, or how would you feel if you already had it? It wouldn't necessarily be this heightened, ecstatic, oh my God, I got $10,000. It's more like, I feel good. It's like life's good, and that's, I mean, it's, if you can get to the place where you're like, life's good, I feel good, things naturally come into my life that are beneficial and abundant for me and others, like that's pretty much what most people are angling for, and I also just want to say quickly, like, the Abraham Hicks thing, if it ain't easy, it ain't coming. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's certainly a valuable perspective to have. Like, some things are hard. Some things are, life can be difficult. I'm sorry. Like, things are not always going to be peachy keen. Like,
exactly.
And I think that can really, people in like the Abraham Hicks community, like there's so much spiritual bypassing there too, where people just are trying to float on cloud nine and they're really depressed and not looking at these issues that are going to haunt them for years if they don't look at them more closely. But the point is, if you're in touch with how you feel more, become more aware of how you feel and more aware of like the power of your imagination, your life should improve, and hopefully the lives of others around you should improve, so.
Yeah, that's been part of the fantastic part. Like, there was a family member of mine that has been just kind of struggling with some like mental stuff lately and, feeling pretty down on themselves. And so one night I, was going to bed, and again, I used my thing of saying, okay, I'm going to bring this person up in my mind. And the only thing I could think of to say was like ideal self, right? Because I had read, Neville and seeing them as like their ideal and etc. And so I'm just like, ideal self. And I just drifted off to sleep. And there was no feeling that I invoked. Like, I didn't like say, oh, I need this feeling for this.
Right.
I just thought of them and thought of that and was very like calm. And that was something that I would want for them. And I want them to, feel better and to, have some success in life. And so the next morning we text every day. And the next morning in the text, like, oh, I forgot to tell you that I've been really like working on my mindset, and it's like amazing the stuff that has, been happening. And I got this like really awesome text from my boss that made me feel like really good. And I just see things changing and blah, blah, blah. It was like so fantastic. And I'm like, that was just from last night. I mean, yesterday morning, they were not in a good place. And from that night and, that day, that was probably, about 4 days ago, each day they're like, oh, this has just been like fantastic. I feel like things are turning around for me. And so it's really neat to be able to see that and to say like, wow, like this is something that you can do, for others, and it's pretty simple. And I do want to make sure that anybody listening, like I have found for me, I do better as I'm drifting off to sleep. Um, my mind wanders quite a lot. But to your point, I don't think that's the way it has to be done. I've also had success with, essentially taking a situation that I did not like, and I did not like the way that I was treated, and I literally parroted affirmations about it to myself, Lord knows for how long. Didn't really do anything like going off to sleep about it. It was just kind of this like affirmation thing that I ran. It all completely came out as, confirmation of like this exact thing that I was affirming to. So I don't think that you necessarily have to do just one or the other. Testing
Yeah,
it, I think, is the best thing
totally.
to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's great to share too. Did you find when you did those more, I call it active affirming, but like, did you find that your conviction grew that something was going to change, or was it like just robotic most of the
No,
time?
it like became where like I really believed it.
Right.
So
So yep,
I
gradually the conviction. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yep.
go to
Yep.
like I
Totally.
always call it like saying delusion, but I seriously, I didn't like the way this person was treating me, and I didn't like the relationship that we had. And so I essentially, sounds kind of silly to say out loud, but I made up like a story pretty much about like what was actually happening. And I essentially kept telling myself that story until I believed it. And then like literally the 3D world of Caesar, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
conformed to what I
It
had just been
conformed.
feeding myself.
Right.
So I'm like, wow, that worked.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was one that I was not overly concerned about, or, but I parroted affirmations to myself of a new story until it came true.
Yep. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. There was something else that I wanted to share with you, and I'm trying to remember
Take your
that I
time.
wanted to touch
I got to
on.
look at my notes too.
Okay, yeah, I'm like, I
My
know
like
that
two
there
things I wrote
was,
down.
I thought there was something else.
We can cover it next time if not.
Yeah, 'cause I
There's
could look
some
more than
we talked
something.
about revision, obviously some.
I love revision, if I haven't
I
made that
also
clear yet.
wonder, we mentioned before we went live, I think too, like this idea of like maybe Neville doesn't remember this stuff because he revised it more. I don't know. Like some of this stuff I think it's more just a memory thing 20 years later.
I think it's a memory thing. I think it's a memory thing in the way that he did things changed. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the promise
or
was of such a profound. The promise affected every aspect of his life. I
yeah,
just don't think he went about life in the same way after that. So
I don't think so either. And I kind of wonder, I don't know, like, so mine with that forgiveness story, I don't know how many times I did it. If I look back, now I also am not talking about this story constantly, so it's not something that I'm
right,
continuing to share or
right,
write about. But I really cannot, like, I can rack my brain, I cannot remember how many times I did it, but I'm pretty sure it was definitely more than one night. But like
yeah,
the one with the family member recently, that was a one night thing.
hmm yeah, yeah. And I mean, and again, this is not to tell you not to do this for as long as it
Mm-mm.
takes. I mean, there's so many great examples of people doing this for months on end. One scene over and over again, night after night, where it works. So,
Yeah.
again, this is basically like be open, use what works for you.
Oh, that's what I was going to say is that I think you will notice when you have a change. So years ago, like over a decade ago, like we were in a really bad financial position, just like not in a
Hmm.
great finances. And I remember this before I knew any of this stuff. But I would go to people's homes that were like our family members that were not in a bad kind of situation. And I distinctly remember being like, oh, could you imagine like what it would feel like to have XYZ kind of house or to be able to buy this kind of food? And it was, I mean, there was like some envy that was, behind that, but it was more of just, I would feel that for a little bit, like, how would this feel if we were able to have this stuff? And my financial situation has drastically changed over the years, to the point that something hit me a couple of days ago where we bought some new lights for the house. We had a house built and we just moved in like last year. And we bought some new lights, and I remember having this like thought, it's like $2,500 worth of lights. And I had this thought where I'm like, oh man, that wasn't bad at all. I can't believe it was only $2,500. And it hit me where I was like, I would have never thought only $2,500 in the past, especially over some lights, because all the lights in our house work just fine. We just wanted ones that look different.
Right.
And so those are the kind of, like, I think, my opinion, when folks are talking about you'll get to the point where it feels natural, that's that natural feeling where
Yep.
like it is a different way that you look at the world.
You're occupying a different state. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Your perception's different. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that was one I wanted to touch on.
Very important. Well, Cecilia, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me on again. That was fun. I like these conversations.
We'll do it again soon. And yeah, keep on sharing these late Neville tidbits. Wow. I can't believe you actually pulled me in enough to read a couple of
I know
Neville's
I'm
later
impressed.
lectures again.
I'm going to add that to a win.
Since like 2015 or 16, probably, since I'd read some of that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I only read a couple, but
right.
I can see why you like them. If you're familiar with Neville and know his sensibility, he especially because like he really just riffs in some of these later lectures. He gives a lot of personal stories, and it's like he's in a way looser than he was maybe earlier. So yeah, there's definitely some fun points there.
And there's ones that I skip. I get like 3 pages in. I'm like, I got to get out of this. I can't stay here.
Right. Can't occupy that state for too long. All right. Until next time, I'll see you on the text chain. Bye, everybody.